It was 2:43 in the morning when Steph Curry carefully slid out of bed, his movements calculated with the precision of someone who had perfected this silent routine over months. Ayesha slept soundly beside him, her soft and regular breathing creating the only sound in the dark room, while Steph walked on tiptoes through the hallway, each step measured to avoid the spots on the floor that he knew would creak. The house in Atherton was immersed in the typical quietude of the early morning. Hours when the world seems suspended between the departing night and the day that has not yet arrived. Steph descended the stairs like a ghost in his own home, carrying an emotional weight that no one, not even his wife, knew existed. You can perceive that there are moments in life when we become strangers in our own homes, when we develop secret rituals that no one can witness, when the person the world sees during the day becomes merely a performance that hides nocturnal battles that no one imagines we are fighting. Steph headed to his office on the ground floor, that space that during the day was used for business meetings, career planning sessions, and calls with sponsors. But at night, in the silent hours when everyone slept, it became his private confessional, the only place where he could confront the demons that came to visit him when the lights went out and the applause ceased. He turned on his laptop, the blue screen illuminating his face at angles that revealed a tension that few had seen. Lines of worry around his eyes, a stiffness in his jaw that contrasted with the relaxed smile he showed to cameras every day. Google's homepage appeared, that simple white search field that had become his unofficial therapist, his silent confidant, the only place where he could ask the questions he didn't dare ask aloud to anyone. Imposter syndrome professional athletes, Steph typed, his words appearing on the screen like an electronic confession. It wasn't the first time. He had searched for this. In fact, it had become a nocturnal obsession, a compulsion that grew with each game, each victory he felt he didn't completely deserve. How is it possible that someone who revolutionized a sport, who broke records that seemed unbreakable, who won multiple championships, could feel like a fraud? But there was Steph Curry, at 3 in the morning, seeking validation from strangers on the internet for feelings he couldn't admit even to himself during the day. The search. Results appeared. Articles about elite athletes struggling with the feeling that they didn't deserve their success. Studies on the psychology of performance under pressure. Forums where people anonymously shared about feeling like frauds in their own lives. Steph clicked on the first link. Why do successful athletes feel like imposters? He read each word with the intensity of someone searching for a cure, for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of the emotional whirlwind that visited him every night. Many elite athletes report feeling that their success is a result of luck rather than skill, he read, the words echoing in his mind like a medical diagnosis. They live in constant fear of being discovered as not being as talented as everyone thinks. The description hit him like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly how he felt after every exceptional game, after every impossible shot that went in, after every time commentators called him the greatest shooter in history. Instead of feeling validated, he felt like he was fooling everyone, like it was only a matter of time until his luck ran out and everyone discovered he wasn't really special. Robert Kim, his official sports therapist, had tried to address mental pressure issues with him during regular sessions, but Steph always diverted the conversation, always insisted he was fine, always maintained that facade of unshakable confidence that had become his trademark. But here, alone with the blue glow of the computer screen, he could be honest about the thoughts that tormented him. What if I'm not really as good as everyone thinks? What if I've just been lucky for years? What if one day I wake up and can't make these shots anymore? Steph opened a new tab and typed, "How to deal with performance anxiety athletes." More articles appeared, more stories of athletes who had struggled with similar issues. He read about Michael Jordan having anxiety attacks before important games, about Serena Williams questioning her own talent after dominant victories, about Tom Brady feeling like he was fooling everyone during his legendary career. The validation of knowing that other iconic athletes had experienced similar feelings brought temporary relief, but also intensified a question that tormented him. If even the greatest of all time felt this way, did it mean these feelings would never go away? Anthony Jang, a sports psychologist whose articles Steph had been reading religiously, wrote, "The pressure to maintain a public image of confidence can make athletes feel like they're living a lie. They become actors playing a version of themselves, and over time, they can lose touch with who they really are beneath the public persona." These words resonated so deeply that Steph had to stop reading for a moment. It was exactly how he felt. Like Steph Curry, the confident and smiling player the world knew, was a performance he had perfected, while Steph Curry, the man full of doubts and insecurities, was who he really was. He opened another tab, Signs of Depression in Successful Men. The search made him hesitate for a moment. Was he really considering that he might be depressed? He had an incredible life, loving family, successful career, financial security, the respect of millions of people. How could he be depressed? But as he read the symptoms listed in the article, an uncomfortable realization began to form. Feelings of inadequacy despite external success, difficulty sleeping, constant worry about performance, feeling disconnected from personal achievements, fear of disappointing others. Each symptom was a precise description of how he had been feeling in recent months. The fragmented sleep, the racing thoughts about games that had already ended, the inability to truly savor victories because he was always worried about the next opportunity to fail. Tyler Brooks, a sports journalist who had written extensively about mental health in sports, had published an article titled "The Hidden Cost of Greatness: How the Pressure to Be Perfect is Destroying Elite Athletes." Steph clicked on the link and read every word as if it were a description of his own life. Athletes at the top of their sports often develop a toxic relationship with success, the article explained. Each victory becomes not a celebration, but temporary relief from constant anxiety about failing. They become addicted not to the joy of competing, but to the relief of not disappointing. Steph stopped reading and looked at his own hands, the same hands that had made thousands of impossible shots, that had held championship trophies, that had signed contracts that changed his life. But in this moment, these hands trembled slightly, with the realization that the article was describing exactly how he felt about basketball lately. When was the last time he had truly felt pure joy playing? When was the last time a successful game made him feel genuine pride, instead of just relief at not having failed publicly? He typed another search, "How to Hide Anxiety from Family." The results that appeared were devastatingly specific. Articles about men who kept their mental struggles secret to protect their loved ones, about husbands who developed emotional double lives, about fathers who became actors in their own homes. Connor Smith, a family therapist, had written, "When men hide their mental health struggles from their families, they often believe they're protecting their loved ones. In reality, they're creating emotional distance that can be more harmful than honest vulnerability." Steph thought about Ayesha, sleeping peacefully upstairs, completely unaware of the emotional storm he faced every night. How many times had she asked if he was okay, and he had responded with an automatic smile and a, "Sure, baby. Why wouldn't I be?" How many opportunities had he missed to be real with the person who loved him most? But the idea of admitting his insecurities to Ayesha seemed impossible. She had known him as this confident young man with big dreams, had fallen in love with his unwavering determination. How could he now admit that he felt like a fraud, that he doubted his own talent, that sometimes he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person he had become? It was almost 4 in the morning when Steph closed the laptop, another nocturnal session of searching for answers that only generated more questions. He would go back upstairs to the bedroom, lie down beside Ayesha, and pretend to sleep until the alarm went off a few hours later. And tomorrow he would wake up, put on the Warriors uniform, smile for the cameras, and play once again the role of Steph Curry. The man who had everything under control, who never doubted himself, who had the perfect life. But for now, in the silent hours between night and day, he was just a man haunted by questions he couldn't ask anyone except Google, carrying secrets that grew heavier with each search, each article read, each night spent looking for answers that seemed always to be one click beyond his reach. Great truths about human vulnerability often emerge not in moments of public triumph, but in the silent hours when we are alone with our fears, when the mask we wear for the world becomes too heavy to sustain, and when we discover that even the most extraordinary success cannot protect us from fundamental questions about our own worth and adequacy. The days that followed Steph's nocturnal research sessions were like carefully choreographed performances, where each public interaction was calculated to maintain the image of a man who had his life completely under control. But beneath this meticulously maintained facade, the words he had read in the early morning hours echoed like a constant soundtrack of doubt and questioning. It was a Wednesday in October, and Steph was in the Chase Center locker room preparing for another game against the Lakers. Around him, his teammates chatted and joked with the typical camaraderie of professional athletes, but Steph felt as if he were watching everything through glass, physically present, but emotionally disconnected from his colleagues' simple joy. "Steph, you're quiet today," observed James Wilson, the Warriors' veteran center, while tying his shoes. "Everything okay, brother?" Steph forced that smile that had become his second nature, an expression that appeared automatically whenever someone questioned his emotional state. "I'm great, man. Just focused on today's game." You can perceive that sometimes we lie so consistently about our well-being that the lie becomes indistinguishable from truth, even to ourselves. Steph had become a master of emotional redirection, transforming every question about his feelings into a discussion about basketball, strategy, or anything that didn't require real honesty about what was happening in his inner world. But as he warmed up on the court before the game, the previous night's searches were still fresh in his mind. He had read about something called anticipatory anxiety, the fear not of failure itself, but of the fear of being afraid, a psychological spiral that could transform even elite athletes into prisoners of their own minds. Each shot during warm-ups was accompanied by a stream of thoughts he couldn't silence. What if I miss the first shots? What if people notice I'm nervous? What if I have a bad night and everyone starts questioning whether I'm losing my ability? Marcus Williams, the assistant coach, approached him during warm-ups. "Steph, you look tense. Remember, it's just basketball. You've done this thousands of times." "It's just basketball." The words should have been comforting, but for Steph, they only intensified the pressure. If it was just basketball, why did he feel like he was carrying the weight of the world with each shot? Why did something that used to be natural and joyful now feel like a constant test of his worth as a person? During the game, Steph played well. 28 points, 7 assists, 5 three-pointers made. For any external observer, it was a typical Steph Curry performance. But internally, he was cataloging every mistake, every missed shot, every moment of hesitation as evidence that he was losing his ability. "Curry is on fire tonight," shouted the television commentator during the third quarter when Steph hit his fourth consecutive three-pointer. The crowd exploded in EG1 applause, his teammates congratulated him, and the whole world saw another example of Steph Curry's genius. But Steph didn't hear the applause. All he could think was, "I almost missed that shot. If it had been a few inches to the left, everyone would think I'm losing my accuracy. I have to hit the next one to prove it wasn't luck." How is it possible that success can become a prison? That each achievement, instead of building confidence, can only increase the pressure to repeat the performance? Steph was discovering that being considered the greatest shooter in history meant that every missed shot was scrutinized, every mediocre game was analyzed, every sign of humanity was interpreted as decline. After the game, during press conferences, Steph offered his usual responses with that relaxed smile journalists expected. "We just try to play our game, execute our system, trust each other," he said, the words coming out automatically after years of practice. But when he got home that night, Ayesha immediately noticed something different in his behavior. "You played incredibly tonight," she said, hugging him when he came through the door. "I watched the entire game. You were absolutely on fire." "It was an okay game," Steph responded, his tone surprisingly flat for someone who had just had a dominant performance. "I missed some shots I should have made." Ayesha stepped back slightly to look at his face. In 12 years of marriage, she had learned to read the nuances in his expressions, and something about the way he was discounting his own success worried her. "Steph, you scored 28 points in a game you won by 15 points. How can you call that okay?" Steph simply shrugged and changed the subject, but Ayesha noticed. She had begun to notice many things lately. How he seemed disconnected even during moments of celebration. How his responses to basketball questions had become mechanical. How he seemed to be playing the role of Steph Curry instead of simply being himself. That night, Steph waited until he was sure Ayesha was asleep before making his familiar journey to the office. 2:15 in the morning, a bit earlier than usual, but the thoughts in his head were particularly loud that night. He turned on the laptop and typed, "Why do I feel empty after victories?" The results were devastatingly relevant. Articles about anhedonia in athletes, about how constant pressure can drain joy, even from activities we used to love. Tyler Brooks, the same journalist whose articles Steph had been reading, had written a particularly impactful piece titled, "When Winning is No Longer Enough: The Existential Crisis of Elite Athletes." Many athletes at the peak of their careers report a growing sense of emptiness, the article explained. Victories that used to bring pure joy become merely temporary relief from constant anxiety. They find themselves moving from achievement to achievement, always searching for that feeling of satisfaction that seems always to be escaping. Steph stopped reading and looked at the walls of his office, decorated with photos of triumphant moments from his career. Championship celebrations, broken records, moments that should represent pure joy. But looking at these images now, all he could remember was the anxiety he had felt before each of these games, the relief instead of celebration he had felt afterward. He opened a new tab and typed, "High-functioning depression." The results were both enlightening and terrifying. People with high-functioning depression often maintain successful careers and apparently healthy relationships while internally struggling with persistent feelings of inadequacy, emptiness, and despair, he read. They become experts at masking their symptoms, often even from themselves. Daniel Patel, a clinical psychologist specializing in elite athletes, had written, "The paradox of extreme success is that it can isolate people from their own emotions. They become so focused on maintaining performances that they lose touch with who they are when they're not performing." Steph closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had felt genuinely happy. Not relieved, not proud of a performance, but simply happy to be alive, to be playing basketball, to be with his family. The memory seemed slippery, like trying to hold water with his hands. He typed another search. How to ask for help for depression when you have a public image. The articles that appeared were simultaneously encouraging and discouraging, stories of celebrities who had sought treatment, but also discussions about how public vulnerability could be used against public figures. Kevin O'Connor, a therapist specializing in working with professional athletes, had written, "The fear of appearing weak or unstable often prevents athletes from seeking the help they need. They fear that admitting mental struggles could affect their career, their contracts, or how they're perceived by fans." Steph thought about his endorsement contracts, about his image as a role model for children around the world, about how his public persona was built around being the smiling, confident guy who overcame obstacles through hard work and faith. How could he admit he felt like a fraud without destroying everything he had built? But as he read article after article about athletes who had found courage to seek help, Steph began to feel something he hadn't experienced in months. A small spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't really alone. Maybe these feelings didn't mean he was weak or inadequate. Maybe it was possible to find help without destroying everything he had built. It was almost 5 in the morning when Steph finally closed the laptop. Another night of research that had left him simultaneously more hopeful and more scared. He knew he couldn't continue living this double life forever. The confident Steph during the day and the tormented Steph at night. But he still wasn't ready to break the silence. He still wasn't ready to remove the mask that had become as much a part of his identity as his three-point shots. For now, he would continue to play the role, continue smiling for the cameras, continue being the Steph Curry the world expected to see. And every night, he would continue returning to Google, searching for answers he was beginning to suspect he could only find through the courage to be vulnerable with the people who loved him most. Great truths about mental health teach us that external success cannot cure internal wounds, that performance can mask but not eliminate pain, and that sometimes the people who seem to have everything under control are exactly those who most need support, understanding, and the freedom to be imperfect without losing the love of those who matter. It was a Thursday afternoon in late November, and Ayesha Curry was at home organizing Steph's office for an important meeting he would have the next day with his business managers. She had noticed that Steph had been even more distracted lately, forgetting appointments and leaving important papers scattered everywhere, so she decided to help by organizing the space he used for work. While arranging piles of documents and reorganizing shelves, Ayesha couldn't help but notice how Steph had changed in recent months. Not in obvious ways that others might perceive. He still smiled in interviews, still played incredibly well, still was affectionate with her and the children. But there was something in the silences between words, in the way he seemed always slightly absent, even when physically present. You can sense that sometimes we know someone so intimately that we can detect subtle changes that are invisible to the rest of the world, small deviations in the emotional pattern of a person we love that suggest something is happening beneath the surface, something they may not even have words to explain. Ayesha was cleaning Steph's desk when she accidentally knocked over his laptop mouse, making the screen light up and revealing that the computer hadn't been completely closed. Her intention wasn't to invade Steph's privacy. She was simply trying to close the laptop properly when she saw that several tabs were still open in the browser. What she saw on the screen made her stop completely, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. There were multiple tabs open, all with searches related to mental health. Symptoms of depression in successful men, how to hide anxiety from family, imposter syndrome in elite athletes, signs that you need therapy. Ayesha felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked on one of the tabs and saw an entire page about masked depression, with highlighted sections about people who maintain successful careers while internally struggling with feelings of inadequacy and despair. No, 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 she whispered to herself, part of her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Steph couldn't be going through this. He was the most successful person she knew, the man who had achieved dreams that seemed impossible, who had a loving family and a career that inspired millions. But as she clicked through the tabs, each search painted a clearer and more devastating picture. A search for how to pretend you're okay when you're not had been made at 2:37 in the morning on Tuesday. Another about famous athletes with depression had been conducted at 3:15 in the morning on Sunday. How is it possible that someone you love is suffering so deeply right beside you, and you don't notice? Ayesha tried to think of signs she might have missed, moments when Steph might have tried to ask for help without saying it directly. She remembered recent conversations where Steph had made comments that, at the time, seemed casual, but now took on a completely different meaning. "Sometimes I wonder if I deserve all this," he had said, after a particularly impressive victory. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to know what I'm doing," he had murmured after a successful interview. She had interpreted these comments as humility, as the characteristic modesty that had always been part of Steph's charm. Now she realized they might have been disguised cries for help, attempts to communicate pain he didn't know how to express directly. Ayesha clicked on the browsing history and felt her heart completely break. Page after page of searches about anxiety, depression, imposter syndrome, psychological pressure in athletes. The searches dated back months and continued until the previous night. A digital chronology of silent suffering that had been happening right under her nose. "How not to hurt family with mental problems," one search said. "Should I tell wife about depression?" said another. "How to protect children from depressed father," was among the most recent. Tears began to roll down Ayesha's face as she realized the complete extent of what Steph had been going through alone. He wasn't just struggling with mental health issues, but was carrying the additional weight of trying to protect the family from knowledge of his struggle. You can perceive that sometimes love can be so intense that it transforms into a form of isolation. When someone we love so much decides to carry their pain alone to spare us from suffering, without realizing that their attempt to protect us is actually depriving us of the opportunity to love them through their vulnerability. Ayesha continued reading, each article Steph had visited revealing more about her husband's mental state. She saw that he had searched for therapists specializing in professional athletes, but had also searched for consequences of athletes who admit mental problems and impact of therapy on sports career. It was obvious that Steph wanted to seek help, but was terrified about how it might affect his career, his public image, and his ability to support the family the way he always had. One particularly devastating search was, "I'm a fraud, and everyone will find out." Ayesha had to stop reading for a moment, putting a hand over her heart, while trying to process that Steph, her Steph, who was genuinely one of the most talented and hardworking people she had known, felt like a fraud. She thought about all the recent nights when she had woken up and noticed Steph wasn't in bed, assuming he had gone to the bathroom or was checking on the children. Now she realized he was probably here, in this office, researching alone about problems he was too scared to share with her. Marcus Williams, the family therapist she and Steph had consulted years ago during a difficult period in their marriage, had always emphasized the importance of open communication. "Secrets are like poison in a relationship," he had said. "They grow in darkness and become much bigger and scarier than they need to be." Ayesha remembered those words as she looked at months of Steph's secret searches, realizing he had been living a completely separate emotional life during the hours when she slept. She clicked on another tab and found a forum where people discussed imposter syndrome anonymously. A recent post caught her attention. "I'm successful on paper, but I feel like I'm fooling everyone. How can I stop feeling like a fraud?" The post wasn't signed, but as Ayesha read the words, she recognized Steph's voice in every sentence. "Everyone thinks I have my life under control, but internally I feel like I'm just getting lucky. I'm afraid that one day people will discover I'm not really as special as they think. How is it possible that the person you love most in the world is feeling this way and you don't know?" Ayesha felt a devastating mixture of pain for Steph's suffering and guilt for not having noticed what was happening. She remembered recent moments when Steph had tried to initiate conversations about pressure and expectations, and she had quickly reaffirmed her confidence in him and changed the subject, thinking she was being encouraging. Now she realized he might have been trying to open a door to a deeper conversation, and she had inadvertently closed that door. The sound of the front door opening made Ayesha jump. Steph was coming home from practice earlier than expected. Quickly, she tried to close the laptop, but her hands were shaking so much that she accidentally clicked on a few more tabs, revealing even more searches about anxiety and depression. "Ayesha," Steph's voice echoed down the hallway. "Are you home?" "I'm in the office," she called back, her voice breaking slightly as she tried to compose herself. But it was too late. She had seen too much, learned too much, understood too much about her husband's silent suffering to simply pretend nothing had happened. Steph appeared in the office doorway, his face lighting up with that familiar smile when he saw her. "What are you doing here, baby?" But the smile disappeared instantly when he saw the expression on Ayesha's face, when he noticed his laptop was open, when he comprehended in a moment of absolute horror that his deepest secrets had been discovered. "Steph," Ayesha said, her voice barely able to come out through tears, "we need to talk." And in that moment, at the entrance to the office where Steph had spent months searching for answers in the lonely darkness of the internet, the carefully constructed world of secrets and performances was about to collapse, making way for the kind of vulnerable honesty that both had avoided, but that would become the key to saving not only Steph's mental well-being, but the intimacy of their marriage. Great truths about relationships teach us that secrets kept out of love often cause more damage than the honest vulnerability we try to avoid, and that sometimes the most devastating discoveries become opportunities for deeper kinds of intimacy that are only possible when all masks finally fall. The 3D silence that followed Ayesha's words hung in the office like a storm cloud about to explode, charged with months of unspoken secrets, silent pain, and a marital intimacy that had been tested in ways neither had anticipated when they made their vows years ago. Steph looked at the open laptop, at the multiple tabs of mental health searches still visible on the screen, and felt as if his entire soul was being exposed under merciless light. All the energy he had spent building walls around his vulnerability, all the careful performance of being the husband and father who had everything under control, crumbled in an instant. "Ayesha," he began, his voice barely able to come out through the knot in his throat. "I can explain." But before he could formulate some excuse or explanation, Ayesha stood up from the chair and walked directly to him, tears flowing freely down her face. Instead of anger or accusation, her eyes carried something Steph hadn't expected. A devastating mixture of love, pain, and a compassion so deep that it made him immediately realize he had completely underestimated his wife's capacity to handle his vulnerability. "Steph," she said, placing her hands gently on both sides of his face, "why didn't you tell me you were suffering?" You can perceive that sometimes the simplest questions carry the power to completely break down the defenses we build, to force us to confront not just our secrets, but the reasons we keep them, the stories we tell ourselves about why we need to carry our pain alone. The gentleness in Ayesha's voice, the absence of judgment or disappointment, hit Steph more deeply than any confrontation could have. In a moment, all the careful justification he had built for keeping his problems secret, protecting his family, maintaining his image, avoiding being a burden, crumbled before the realization that he had been depriving Ayesha of the opportunity to love him through his struggle. "I didn't want to worry you," Steph whispered, his own tears beginning to fall. "You already have so much to deal with the children, with your career, with everything. I didn't want to add my problems to your list." "Steph," Ayesha said, pulling him into a hug that carried 12 years of marriage, of partnership, of love that had survived previous challenges and was about to be tested in a new way. "Your problems are my problems. Your pain is my pain. That's how marriage works. How is it possible that well-intentioned attempts to protect those we love can actually rob them of the opportunity to demonstrate the depth of their love?" Steph was discovering that by trying to spare Ayesha from his struggle, he had inadvertently prevented her from being the partner and support she wanted to be. They sat together on the office couch, Steph finally finding words to describe months of internal battles he had fought alone. He told her about waking up in the middle of the night with his heart racing, about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person he saw, about feeling like a fraud even after his best performances. "Every game became a test," he explained, his voice gaining strength as he found courage to be completely honest. "Not an opportunity to play something I love, but a chance to fail publicly. And when I played well, instead of feeling joy, I felt only relief at not having disappointed people one more time." Ayesha listened without interrupting, holding Steph's hand and occasionally wiping tears from her own eyes as she began to understand the extent of what her husband had been going through alone. "And the worst part," Steph continued, "is that I knew I should be grateful. I have an incredible life, a family I love, a career millions of people would dream of having. How could I admit I felt empty when I had everything I always wanted?" "Steph," Ayesha said gently, "depression isn't about not having reasons to be grateful. It's about brain chemistry, about pressure, about being human. You can have a blessed life and still struggle with mental health issues." The validation in her words, the absence of judgment or suggestions that he should simply cheer up or focus on positive things, brought a relief Steph hadn't experienced in months. For the first time, He didn't feel like he had to justify or explain his feelings. He could simply feel them and be accepted. I researched therapists, Steph admitted, but I got scared about how it might affect my career. What if it leaked to the media? What if sponsors decided I'm no longer the image they want? What if people started questioning whether I can handle the pressure of important games? Ayesha shook her head, a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. Baby, if any company or person judges you for taking care of your mental health, those aren't people who deserve to have you representing them. And as for fans and media, you've used your platform to inspire people for years. Imagine how many people you could help by being honest about this struggle. The perspective of transforming his vulnerability into something that could help others hadn't occurred to Steph during all those months of solitary research. He had been so focused on hiding his struggle that he hadn't considered how sharing it might create connections and offer hope to other people facing similar battles. But what if I'm different after therapy? Steph asked, voicing a fear that had prevented him from seeking help. What if working on my problems changed who I am as a player? What if my competitive edge comes from the same place as my anxiety? Steph, Ayesha said, looking directly into his eyes, you are more than a basketball player. You are my husband, father of our children, a child of God. Even if therapy changed your game, which I doubt, you would still be everything that matters most to me. Robert Kim, the sports therapist Steph had avoided for months, received a call that afternoon. But this time, it wasn't Steph calling alone. It was Steph and Ayesha together, ready to begin a healing process that would involve not only Steph's individual work on his mental health, but also strengthening their communication as a couple. One of the most important things you can learn, Dr. Kim explained during their first joint session, is that vulnerability is not weakness. It's courage. It takes strength to admit when we need help, to allow other people to see our struggles. During the weeks that followed, Steph began an individual therapy process that helped him develop tools for dealing with performance anxiety and imposter syndrome. He learned mindfulness techniques he could use before games, cognitive strategies to challenge automatic negative thoughts, and ways to reconnect with his original joy for basketball. But equally important was the work he and Ayesha did together to rebuild intimacy in their marriage. They established regular mental health check-ins, created an environment where Steph felt safe to express insecurities without judgment, and developed signals so Ayesha could offer extra support during periods of particular stress. The hardest thing for me, Ayesha admitted during one of the couple's therapy sessions, was realizing that while I thought I was being a supportive wife, by always reaffirming your strength and confidence, I was inadvertently closing the door to conversations about vulnerability. 3 months after the day Ayesha discovered Steph's searches, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible during his darkest days. He decided to speak publicly about his struggle with anxiety and imposter syndrome. The interview he gave to James Wilson, a respected journalist, broke viewership records and generated thousands of supportive messages from fans who had experienced similar struggles. More importantly, there were no negative career consequences. In fact, several sponsors expressed pride that Steph was using his platform to destigmatize mentally health issues. I thought that admitting I struggled with anxiety and depression would make people lose faith in me, Steph said during the interview. But what I discovered is that being honest about my struggles made people connect with me in a deeper way. It reminded me that people don't need me to be perfect. They need me to be real. Daniel Patel, the psychologist whose articles Steph had read during his sleepless nights, wrote a response to the interview. Steph Curry did something brave that will have lasting impact. By normalizing conversations about mental health for elite athletes, he created permission for other competitors to seek the help they need. 6 months later, Steph was playing the best basketball of his career, not because he had eliminated all anxiety or doubt, but because he had learned to work with these feelings instead of against them. He had discovered that acknowledging his humanity, instead of trying to hide it, had actually made him a more resilient competitor. But the most significant transformation didn't happen on basketball courts. It happened at home, where Steph and Ayesha had created a new kind of intimacy based on complete honesty, where their daughters were growing up seeing that adults can struggle with problems and seek help, where the family had learned that true love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence, honesty, and the courage to be vulnerable. The irony, Steph reflected during a follow-up interview a year later, is that I spent so much time trying to protect my family from my struggle that I almost lost the opportunity to let them love me through it. The vulnerability I thought would be my weakness became the foundation for deeper relationships than I ever imagined possible. And in that house in Atherton, where everything had begun with solitary Google searches during the early morning hours, there were now open conversations about mental health, regular check-ins about emotional well-being, and a family that had learned that true strength doesn't come from hiding problems, but from facing them together, with love, support, and the understanding that we are all human beings trying to do the best we can. Great truths about healing teach us that the secrets we carry to protect those we love often prevent us from experiencing the kind of love that is only possible when all masks fall, when vulnerability meets compassion, and when we discover that being known completely, including our struggles and imperfections, doesn't make us less worthy of love, but creates opportunities to be loved in ways we never imagined possible.